So thank you very much for this opportunity to present my new monograph, The EU as a Global Digital Actor. And the subtitle of the book is on institutionalizing global data protection, trade, and cybersecurity. And the idea for this book stems from this concern as to how to frame the topic more holistically. And the book is comprised of 6 chapters, 3 chapters broadly introducing the general themes: the EU as a global data actor, nudging global convergence; the EU as a digital trade actor, on weak institutionalization and strong standardization; on the EU as a cyber actor; and then 3 case studies on the transatlantic divide, with the US, East Asian convergence as to Japan, and reverse convergence as to China. And the book is comprised in each of these chapters of a variety of sections, mostly about 8 subsections, which I think is a complex question as to how to subdivide themes that are ever expanding. So I hope that the reader will bear with me as to the scope, the depth, and the breadth of possibilities in such a burgeoning field. And overall, I argue that the EU is a global digital actor, which is attempting to advance global data flows and digital trade in particular through the framework of EU-centric institutionalization, as I frame it. And I'm looking at data transfers, data protection, trade, and cybersecurity using 3 large-scale regimes, or 3 very large sets of studies as to the US, Japan, and China. And I think it's very complex to say how to capture digital actorness. There's no universal formula for data issues in a trade agreement. Cybersecurity, intellectual property, transparency to frictionless movement of tech workers all comprise such issues. But ultimately, there's no global privacy or cybersecurity treaty, and the EU has had first mover advantage in many domains, but I argue that a much more holistic focus is needed to go beyond the GDPR, looking at cross-cutting areas of data governance, transfer, digital trade, cyber regulation, and a few other things that I touch upon very briefly. And the broader conception of the book comes from this desire to frame EU-centric institutionalization, institution building being the foundation of the EU policy. And I frame it as EU-centric institutionalization, the EU's unique commitment internally and externally to institutionalization practices, seeing, have this longer term vision of society through institutions. And as a liberal non-realist, the EU has a very consistent history of promoting and nudging multilateral innovations, generating convergence with international law. And so I really have this desire to frame much of this as an attempt to go beyond court-centric EU law, which is, I think, for the most part, often very justified. The Court of Justice even had a birthday party to celebrate its own most activist decision and invited a huge number of scholars to this party. It's a very much a core aspect of doing EU law. And I think that institutionalization is a book that has very little case law in it, is a topic that is slightly removed from that. Or I try to stand away from the judicialization debates as to EU law to frame this slightly differently. And to take it, to another extent, from the International Court, Criminal Court and Multilateral Investment Court, to the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee, to International Regulatory Cooperation, to WTO Workarounds, Reforms, the Trade and Technology Council, there's no shortage of examples of showing the EU's external efforts to engage in institutionalization beyond the state, and always challenging classic IOR theory that it's easier to maintain international organizations than to create a new one. And I argue in the book that institutionalization is a very bland term. It's commonly misused, and it refers to bottom-up processes of stabilization, accountability, and activeness, all merging together as part of a narrative. It's not a very clean or perfect or a simplistic idea. But in general, the EU has many forms of data regimes that vary in scale, complexity, but mostly has to do institutional design. And it's, of course, a very European idea to turn to institutions and deeper forms of oversight and accountability and legitimation. And so when I began this book at the start of lockdown, or perhaps a little bit earlier than that, in some cases, I conceived of the 3 case studies as being as the US a near example, Japan a far example, and a China example as not being at all. And I have to say that my conclusions, I think, are radically different to that. So in this very brief vlog, I'm not attempting to outline in much detail, try to sketch what I can for you, but obviously the reader can consult the text if they'd like to have hopefully a much more in-depth read of this. But to zoom in on something that I think a lot of people know an awful lot about, of the many forms of transatlantic institutional cooperation, many forms of transatlantic data flows, governance, many actors, the most topical and interesting for many people is probably the US Privacy Shield from 2016, which is born of the death, if you like, and afterlife of the Safe Harbor Agreement. And it's a very interesting form of transatlantic institutional cooperation because it set itself apart as having an ombudsman and having deeper forms of reviews, broader reviews than ever previously. But we can say if you're looking for international agreements or regimes as to data transfers, transatlantic relations has no shortage of them. And it has lots of law and governance over the years, generally rather weakly institutionalized, many forms of evolving convergence of values. And the Privacy Shield is the afterlife of the Safe Harbor regime, are arguably struck down for a whole variety of reasons. But the annual review process, year in, year out, after this new regime, very shortly, after a short number of months of negotiation was put into place, there was an effort to see that the Commission could evaluate itself how data was transferred from a commercial and security perspective. And the Court of Justice, of course, as hastily, it strikes down the Privacy Shield regime in 2020, and of course it was a very hastily agreed form of arrangement after the initial Schrems 1 decision, but ultimately being a form of very scattered letters, hybrid governance. And the Court of Justice strikes it down as to its weak institutionalization, the lack of independence of the gentleman on Rossins and the Ombudsman appointed very late in the game. But overall, it's largely a lot of soft law that we see as institutionalization, and there's not much alignment between the EU and US historically in data protection and privacy, except for some small tweaks in the post in the Obama era, and never strongly being institutionalized. I've done some work with Fabian Terpan on this, but this all dramatically changed, of course, in April 2022. But before this, just before the Biden presidency, there are 4 US states with increasingly GDPR-esque laws or forms of it, lots of political shifts in the US towards having a privacy bill across the aisles, and seeing actors such as the FTC get very serious about engagement with consumer rights in terms of its consumer dimensions of its portfolio, particularly as to Facebook. So there's a transatlantic privacy framework agreed in 2022, including a court. And in the midst of all this, of course, there's the Trade and Technology Council, which is established, all related to each other. More broadly, though, if we look at the idea of institutions as to digital trade, it's not a very strong regimen or regime that exists in place. There's very limited number of trade agreements have historically established specific institutional arrangements as to e-commerce or the more contemporary lexicon of digital trade. And examples of these might be subcommittees or working groups, or exchanging information, or and the like. Very laconic forms of formulations of these issues. And I think that the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, one of the most significant of its time, and the EU's first post-GDPR data adequacy agreement, is a very interesting example of managed convergence, one of the world's largest data flow areas, where the EU initially refused to negotiate on data, very much outside it. And there's a lot of significant bursts about this. So the agreement is well worth studying for this. To some extent, some people would label it as a less exciting trade agreement, the so-called cars for cheese. But at its time, it was the most comprehensive e-commerce chapter at its time, although fused with other things, and had a series of atypical committees, atypical for the EU, including as to e-commerce and regulatory cooperation, and some very significant, very interesting regulatory cooperation provisions. And putting this all there might not sound to say rocket science, but it very much is the genre of EU engagement in this area. And outside of the trade agreement, there was some very interesting developments from the Japanese Supreme Court, started to show some evidence of strong convergence with EU law, in particular in 2017, as to the right to be forgotten. In the book, I do a lot more on this, but I thought it's just to try to sketch these questions. I think makes a very interesting analysis of what was then perceived to be the most cutting-edge form of EU practice. We look, at the other example, though, however, on China that I do in the book, I don't think I ever anticipated that it would become such an interesting chapter. Arguably, I think it's the most interesting chapter of all time. And it's a very interesting question as to convergence of China values over commonly thought, perceived divergence. Obviously, China has many questions as to its surveillance society at the start of the 21st century. But ultimately, in 2019, it starts to amend its establish a cybersecurity law, which incorporates many cores of GDPR concepts that kind of raising this question as to the de facto and the de jure Brussels effect, and also having a very interesting personal information protection framework law in 2021 with many very notable changes in its laws and as to protection of consumers, and also very interesting multilateral developments, but of course obviously not a kind of a de jure Brussels effect. And alongside all of these developments, the EU and China, after initial bumpy starts up, member states signing up to the Belt and Road Initiative, creating a lot of difficult life for the EU. The EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment was agreed with many interesting elements as to institutionalization, from dialogues to working groups, the typical EU modus operandi. And initially, one might have said that the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the most significant law-light institutional regimes in the world of global governance. And whether or not, well, what has changed remains to be seen. But of course, there's this growing legalization of the Chinese legal order. For example, the adoption of a civil code at the start of 2021, its efforts to join CPTPP or CEP. So lots of very interesting questions here about this soft institutionalization emerging. Obviously, CAI is on pause, but lots of convergence here taking place, but not necessarily of values, and drawing very questionable, obviously looking a lot closer to the EU mode of doing things than even the US. And if you look at things like the EU's global gateway, very meager form of investment regime vehicle, ultimately there's also a law-light institutional regime, despite what is going on in the background. So in this very, very short overview of the book, I've attempted to sketch some issues for you, but just to outline what I would say are some very interesting examples of all of this institutionalization. I would argue matters considerably. There are many benefits for individuals and for human rights. And the EU has engaged in many efforts to constitutionalize private power through institutional framework. And I say constitutionalize with a very small c, but ultimately it's a very active generator of institutional design, architecture, and autonomous bodies, in particular in the digital era, and as to a whole wave of regulation taking place. I focus in this short presentation maybe on the US context, where we see an emerging binding set of provisions as to a transatlantic court, but also EU-China relations, similarly initially also a law-light institution-like study, but also in the background to all of this, a lot of more institutionalization and legalization emerging. So I would have framed the EU-China relations case study initially much the furthest away, but I think this is very difficult to conclude, and it's much more of a study of convergence. So I hope that you found this a very short overview to be interesting. I'd be very interested in hearing people's thoughts, and thank you very much for taking the time to watch this, and I hope to engage with you sometimes shortly soon. Thank you very much.